Moscow, August 19th, 1991, 6 a.m. The radio cuts to classical music. In the Soviet Union, this is never a good sign. For 70 years, whenever the state needed to prepare its citizens for an announcement, the death of a leader, a national emergency, a shift in power, it replaced regular programming with Tchaikovsky. This morning, every channel plays the same thing. Classical music, then a statement. Mikhail Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party, President of the Soviet Union, has been removed from power due to illness. A state committee for the state of emergency has assumed control. Tanks are already moving toward Moscow. The coup has begun. 8 men, senior members of the Soviet establishment, the most powerful figures in the military, the KGB, and the Communist Party, have decided that Gorbachev's reforms have gone too far, that the Soviet Union is collapsing, that someone needs to stop it. They have spent months planning. They have the army. They have the KGB. They have the nuclear codes. They have everything a coup requires. Except one thing. And that one missing piece will unravel everything in exactly 72 hours. This is not a story about a coup that succeeded. It is a story about how the most powerful security state in human history tried to save itself and accidentally signed its own death certificate. Part 1. The machine that built its own trap. To understand August 1991, you need to understand what the Soviet Union had become by that point. Not what it claimed to be, what it actually was. The USSR had been, for most of the 20th century, the most comprehensive attempt in human history to organize an entire society around a single ideology. Marxist-Leninist communism was not just a political system, it was a total claim. On the economy, on culture, on science, on history, on the definition of reality itself. At its peak, the Soviet system controlled 15 republics, hundreds of ethnic groups, and nearly 300 million people spread across 11 time zones. It had launched the first satellite, the first human into space. It had built a military capable of destroying the United States multiple times over. And by 1985, it was quietly dying. Not from external pressure, from internal contradiction. The command economy, the system where Moscow decided what was produced, where, in what quantities, at what price, had reached the limits of what central planning could manage. Shortages were endemic. Corruption was structural. Entire sectors of the economy existed only on paper. The military was consuming 25% of GDP, while ordinary Soviet citizens waited years for a refrigerator. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he understood, with unusual clarity for a man inside the system, that the machine was broken, that if nothing changed, the collapse would come anyway, faster and harder. He introduced 2 concepts that would ultimately destroy everything. Glasnost, openness, a loosening of censorship, the ability to speak, publish, discuss. Perestroika, restructuring, economic and political reforms designed to make the system functional again. What Gorbachev did not understand, what perhaps no one could have understood from inside the machine, was that you cannot partially liberalize a totalitarian system. You cannot open the valve a little. Either the pressure holds, or it doesn't. By 1991, it wasn't holding. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, had declared independence. Other republics were moving toward the door. The Communist Party was fracturing. The economy was in free fall. And, on August 18th, 1991, Gorbachev was preparing to sign a new Union Treaty, a document that would fundamentally restructure the Soviet Union, transferring significant power from Moscow to the republics. For the 8 men who would become the coup plotters, this was the line. The treaty would not save the Soviet Union. It would formalize its dissolution. They decided to act. Part 2. The 8 men. Here is who they were. Gennady Yanayev, the vice president, a colorless apparatchik who would technically become acting president, a man selected for his loyalty and his insignificance who would prove catastrophically unsuited to the role he was now playing. Vladimir Kryukov, head of the KGB, the architect of the plot, the man who had spent his career building the surveillance state and believed with total conviction that the system could still be saved if the right people acted with sufficient decisiveness. Dmitry Yazov, Minister of Defense, and 67-year-old Soviet general of the old school, a man who had fought at Stalingrad, who had built his entire identity around the Soviet military, and who watched Gorbachev's reforms with a kind of horrified disbelief. Boris Pugo, Minister of Internal Affairs, controlled the internal security forces, the police, the interior troops. Valentin Pavlov, Prime Minister, controlled what remained of the Soviet economy. And three others, senior party officials whose names history has largely forgotten because what happens in the next 72 hours makes them irrelevant. These 8 men, collectively controlling the KGB, the military, the internal security forces, and the formal government, believed they had everything needed to restore order. They had one fundamental misunderstanding. They believed the Soviet Union still existed as a functional system. They believed that if they moved the pieces, removed Gorbachev, declared emergency, deployed troops, the machine would obey. They were operating on a map of a country that no longer existed. Part 3. The first 24 hours. August 19th. The coup begins. Gorbachev is at his dacha in Crimea. He is placed under house arrest, communications cut, security replaced, completely isolated from Moscow. The State of Emergency Committee releases its declaration. The new rules: no unauthorized public gatherings, no independent media, no strikes, no demonstrations. Tanks roll into Moscow. Military units take up positions around key government buildings. The world watches footage of T-72 tanks moving through the streets of a European capital in 1991. On paper, the coup looks complete. But here is the first failure, and it is the failure that defines everything that follows. They do not arrest Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin is not Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a reformer who operated within the system, who believed the party could be saved, who ultimately trusted the institutions around him. Yeltsin had already been through his own break with the party. He had been expelled from the Politburo in 1987. He had won election as president of the Russian Federation in June 1991, the first democratically elected leader in Russian history, on a platform of defying Moscow. He was not a man who would sit quietly and wait. On the morning of August 19th, while the tanks are still moving into position, Yeltsin drives from his dacha to the Russian Parliament building, the White House. The KGB has orders to stop him. The orders are not executed. No one can confirm afterward exactly why, whether the unit responsible hesitated, whether the order was deliberately delayed, whether someone in the chain of command blinked. Whatever the reason, Yeltsin arrives at the White House unimpeded. And at 12 p.m. on August 19th, he climbs onto one of the tanks parked outside, a tank sent by the coup plotters, and addresses the crowd that has begun gathering. He declares the coup illegal. He calls for a general strike. He calls on Russian citizens to resist. The image of Yeltsin standing on that tank, one man in a suit on top of a military vehicle sent to intimidate him, speaking into a handheld microphone, is broadcast around the world within hours. In the logic of the coup plotters, this moment should not have been possible. The tanks were supposed to signal the restoration of order. Instead, one man turned a tank into a podium, and the signal it sent was the opposite of what was intended. The coup can be defied. Part 4. The Press Conference. August 19th, 5 p.m. The emergency committee holds a press conference. This is the moment, preserved on video, replayed thousands of times, that defines the failure of the coup more than any tank, any declaration, any military movement. Yanayev, Pavlov, Pugo, and 3 others sit behind a long table facing the international press. They are prepared for questions. They are not prepared for what they look like. Yanayev's hands are shaking, not slightly, visibly, uncontrollably. The cameras catch it, the journalists see it, and in that trembling, something is communicated that no amount of official language can contradict. These men are terrified. They are not the confident architects of a new order. They are frightened bureaucrats who have committed an act they are not certain they can sustain. A journalist asks Yanayev directly, "Where is Gorbachev?" "He is ill," Yanayev says. "We hope he recovers and returns to work." Another journalist asks, "Do you understand that you will be held personally responsible for this?" Yanayev's hands shake harder. Khrushchev, the KGB chief, the man who built this operation, sits beside him and says nothing. In 1917, the Bolsheviks had seized power with total conviction. They believed, with religious certainty, that history was on their side. These men believe nothing. They are trying to stop something, not build something. And the difference between those two postures, in the room, on camera, in front of the world, is total. You cannot project authority you do not feel. The press conference communicates to everyone watching that the coup is not inevitable, that it can be stopped. Part 5. The 48-hour collapse. August 20th, the second day. The crowd around the White House has grown to tens of thousands. People are building barricades. A human chain forms around the building. Ordinary Muscovites, not soldiers, not politicians, standing between the Parliament building and the tanks. Inside the White House, Yeltsin's team is working the phones, calling military commanders, calling foreign governments, calling journalists. And here is where the second critical failure of the coup becomes visible. The military begins to fracture. The coup plotters had assumed military unity. The orders had been given, the troops were deployed. But commanding soldiers to move to a position is not the same as commanding them to fire on civilians. Several tank commanders defect, physically moving their vehicles to protect the White House rather than threaten it. The Taman and Kantemirovskaya divisions, 2 of the most elite units in the Soviet military, receive orders to storm the Parliament building on the night of August the 20th. The orders are not carried out. The commanders refuse. Yazov, the defense minister, the architect of the military component of the coup, sits in his office and makes phone call after phone call to commanders who either don't answer, give non-committal responses, or flatly say they will not move against Russian civilians. He has the army on paper. He does not have it in reality. The distinction between those two things, between formal authority and actual compliance, is the distinction the coup plotters never adequately understood. 3 people die in the chaos near the White House. Caught under tank treads in the darkness, they become martyrs immediately. Their deaths harden the resistance rather than breaking it. August 21st, the third day. Yazov makes the decision unilaterally. He orders the troops to withdraw from Moscow. He does not consult the committee. He does not call a meeting. He simply calls the commanders and tells them to pull back. When Khrushchev learns what Yazov has done, the committee effectively ceases to function as a coherent body. The men who had spent months planning a coup to save the Soviet Union now begin, individually and rapidly, to calculate their own survival. Several of them fly to Crimea, ostensibly to negotiate with Gorbachev, actually to beg. Gorbachev refuses to see them. Boris Pugo returns to Moscow and shoots himself. Yazov is arrested at the airport. Khrushchev is arrested on the tarmac. Yanayev is arrested in his office, reportedly drunk. The coup is over. 72 hours. Not a single shot fired by the resistance. Not a single battle. The most powerful security apparatus in human history, the KGB, the Soviet military, the entire infrastructure of a nuclear superpower, had been defeated by a crowd of civilians with improvised barricades and a politician standing on a tank. Part 6. The Thing They Created. Gorbachev returns to Moscow on August 22nd. He believes he has survived, that the crisis has passed, that reform can continue. He is wrong, but not because of the coup plotters. The coup has done something irreversible that none of its architects intended. It has destroyed the last remaining legitimacy of the Communist Party. For decades, Soviet citizens had lived within the system, not necessarily because they believed in it, but because the system appeared permanent. Inevitable, the kind of thing you adapted to rather than opposed, because opposing it was futile. The coup shattered that perception. The party had just attempted to seize absolute power, and failed within 3 days because ordinary people stood in the street. The emperor had not just been revealed to have no clothes. He had been revealed to have no army willing to enforce the fact. Within days of the coup's failure, Gorbachev suspends the Communist Party. The institution that had ruled the Soviet Union for 74 years ceases to operate. Republic after republic accelerates its declaration of independence. Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, the Caucasus, Central Asia. On December 25, 1991, 4 months after the coup, Gorbachev resigns. He goes on television, announces the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and hands the nuclear briefcase to Boris Yeltsin. The red flag over the Kremlin is lowered. The Russian tricolor replaces it. The Soviet Union, 74 years, 15 republics, 300 million people, the second most powerful state in human history, ceases to exist. Not because the West defeated it, not because an enemy destroyed it, because 8 men tried to stop the inevitable and by trying made it happen faster. Part 7. The Lesson That Outlasts the Empire. Here is what August 1991 reveals. Not about the Soviet Union specifically, but about the architecture of authoritarian power. Authoritarian systems are not held together by force. They are held together by the belief that force will be used. The Soviet system had functioned for 74 years, not because every act of resistance was crushed, but because most people never tested whether it would be. The decision not to resist was not cowardice. It was rational given the information available. What the coup did, accidentally, disastrously, from the perspective of its architects, was provide a test case. And the test case failed publicly. Once it was visible, on television, on radio, on the images of Yeltsin on the tank broadcast worldwide, that resistance was possible, that the military would not fire, that the system would flinch. The calculation changed for everyone. Not just in Moscow, in every republic, in every factory, in every local party office. The Soviet Union did not collapse on August 21st, 1991. It collapsed on August 19th, the moment Yanayev sat down at that press conference with shaking hands and answered questions he could not answer with a confidence he could not manufacture. Because power, at its foundation, is not tanks or missiles or surveillance networks. It is the unquestioned belief in the minds of the governed that resistance is futile. The moment that belief breaks, no army in the world is large enough to rebuild it. The coup plotters knew this. They just never considered that they might be the ones to break it. The Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin on Christmas Day, 1991. Gorbachev handed over the nuclear codes and walked out of the building. No shots fired. No final battle. No last stand. Just a flag coming down. And 74 years of history folding quietly into the past. The machine had finally stopped. Not because someone destroyed it, because no one believed in it anymore.